Dennis Wright had killed 7 innocent people in cold blood, shown no remorse during his trial, and spent 15 years in maximum security isolation, perfecting the art of being unreachable by human compassion. Prison psychologists had classified him as a textbook sociopath, chaplains had given up trying to minister to him, and even hardened guards spoke of him in hushed tones as someone who had surrendered any claim to humanity. But when Jonathan Roumie walked into that sterile visiting room at Pelican Bay State Prison, carrying nothing but a worn copy of Scripture and the weight of playing Jesus for millions of viewers, he was about to hear a confession that would leave every person present questioning everything they thought they knew about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility that even monsters might still have souls. The invitation for Jonathan to visit Pelican Bay had come through Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic chaplain who had been ministering to maximum security inmates for over 20 years. Father Santos had contacted Jonathan's representatives months earlier, explaining that several inmates had requested to meet the actor who portrayed Jesus in The Chosen. Most celebrity prison visits were public relations exercises, carefully orchestrated affairs designed to generate positive media coverage while maintaining safe distances between famous visitors and dangerous criminals. But Father Santos had been clear from the beginning that this would be different. If Jonathan agreed to come, he would meet with inmates in small groups, without cameras, without security barriers, beyond what was absolutely necessary for safety. Jonathan had agreed immediately, despite concerns from his management team and warnings from prison officials about the psychological toll of interacting with men who had committed unspeakable acts of violence. He had spent years preparing for his role as Jesus by studying not just the Gospels, but the full spectrum of human experience, the heights of compassion and the depths of cruelty, the possibility of redemption and the reality of evil. The opportunity to minister to people who represented the darkest aspects of humanity felt like a natural extension of his calling as an actor and as a Christian. The drive to Pelican Bay State Prison took Jonathan through some of California's most beautiful coastal scenery, but the landscape's beauty seemed to fade as he approached the fortress-like complex that housed some of America's most dangerous criminals. The facility's imposing concrete walls, razor wire, and guard towers created an atmosphere of controlled menace that reminded visitors they were entering a place where society sent people it had given up on. Jonathan had visited prisons before, but never a maximum security facility, never a place where inmates were serving multiple life sentences for crimes that defied comprehension. Pelican Bay State Prison had been designed with a specific philosophy that some criminals were so dangerous, so irredeemable, that the only reasonable response was permanent isolation from society and in many cases from each other. The security housing unit, where the most dangerous inmates were held, was essentially a prison within a prison. A series of concrete cells where men spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, emerging only for 1 hour of supervised exercise in slightly larger concrete enclosures that prisoners called dog runs. Dennis Wright had been a resident of the SHU for 15 years, ever since his conviction for the murders of 7 people across 3 California counties. His crimes had been particularly heinous, not just because of their brutality, but because of the methodical way he had selected his victims and the apparent pleasure he had taken in their suffering. The prosecution had described him as a textbook psychopath, someone who viewed other human beings as objects to be manipulated and destroyed for his own gratification. Wright's trial had been a media sensation, partly because of the horrific nature of his crimes, but also because of his complete lack of remorse or emotional response to the testimony of survivors and victims' families. He had sat through weeks of heart-wrenching testimony with the same blank expression, showing no more concern for the pain he had caused than if he had been listening to a weather report. When given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing, he had simply said, "I did what I did because I wanted to. I'm not sorry." The judge had imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, effectively ensuring that Wright would die in prison. Prison officials had initially hoped that years of isolation and the opportunity for reflection might lead Wright to show some signs of remorse or humanity. But 15 years had passed without any indication of emotional development or spiritual awakening. He had refused all attempts at counseling, shown no interest in educational programs, and maintained the same cold detachment that had characterized his behavior during the trial. Even hardened correctional officers, accustomed to dealing with violent criminals, found Wright unsettling in his complete absence of recognizable human emotion. Father Santos had been ministering at Pelican Bay for 2 decades, and in that time he had seen every possible variation of human behavior among the inmates. He had witnessed genuine conversions that transformed violent men into sources of hope for other prisoners. He had also encountered inmates who used religion as a tool for manipulation, claiming faith while continuing to scheme and cause harm. But Dennis Wright had always been in a category by himself, completely uninterested in any form of human connection, religious or otherwise. Which is why Father Santos had been shocked when Wright submitted a formal request to meet with Jonathan Roumie. The request had come through proper channels, filled out in Wright's precise handwriting on the standard form used for all inmate requests for religious consultation. Under reason for request, Wright had written simply, "Need to discuss theological questions with actor who portrays Jesus Christ." The chaplain had read the form 3 times, certain there had been some mistake or that Wright was planning some kind of manipulation or harm. Father Santos had initially planned to deny the request. Wright had shown no previous interest in religious matters, had never attended chapel services, and had explicitly refused all previous attempts at spiritual counseling. The chaplain suspected that Wright's sudden interest in meeting Jonathan was motivated by curiosity about celebrity rather than genuine spiritual seeking. But something about the request nagged at him. Wright had never asked for anything in 15 years, had never shown interest in meeting anyone, and had carefully avoided any situation that might lead to human connection. After considerable prayer and consultation with prison administrators, Father Santos decided to approve the request, but with strict conditions. The meeting would take place in a secure visiting room, with guards present. Wright would be restrained according to standard protocols for maximum security inmates. The conversation would be limited to 30 minutes, and Father Santos would be present throughout the encounter. If Wright showed any signs of hostility or attempted manipulation, the meeting would be terminated immediately. Jonathan had been briefed extensively about Wright's history and psychological profile before the visit. Prison psychologists had prepared him for what they described as a potentially disturbing encounter with someone who might attempt to shock or manipulate him for entertainment. They warned him about Wright's complete lack of empathy, his history of violence, and his ability to present himself as rational while harboring deeply antisocial thoughts and impulses. The visiting room at Pelican Bay was designed to minimize comfort and maximize security. Gray concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, metal furniture bolted to the floor, and one-way mirrors that allowed guards to observe without being seen. Jonathan had been searched thoroughly before entering, and he understood that every word of the conversation would be monitored and recorded. He sat at the small metal table, his worn Bible placed in front of him, and waited for his first encounter with a man who represented the darkest possibilities of human nature. Dennis Wright entered the room in full restraints, handcuffs connected to a chain around his waist, ankle shackles that limited his movement to small shuffling steps. 2 guards accompanied him, maintaining positions near the door, while Wright was seated across from Jonathan at the metal table. Wright was 51 years old, of average height and build, with graying hair and pale skin that reflected his years of confinement away from sunlight. What struck Jonathan immediately was not Wright's appearance, but his eyes, cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the warmth or vulnerability that Jonathan had learned to recognize as signs of basic humanity. For the first several minutes, Wright simply stared at Jonathan without speaking. It was a predatory stare, the kind of focused attention that made its recipient feel like prey being evaluated by a hunter. Jonathan had been warned about this behavior. Wright's tendency to use silence and intense eye contact as a form of psychological intimidation. Most people found it deeply uncomfortable to be studied so closely by someone with Wright's history, but Jonathan maintained calm eye contact and waited patiently for Wright to begin speaking. "So you're the actor who thinks he's Jesus," Wright finally said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I've been watching your show, Interesting Interpretation of Divinity." Jonathan had prepared for various possible opening statements, but Wright's calm, almost academic tone caught him off guard. "I don't think I'm Jesus, Dennis. I'm just an actor who has been blessed with the opportunity to portray him. What did you want to discuss?" Wright leaned back in his chair as much as his restraints would allow, continuing to study Jonathan with the same predatory intensity. "I wanted to meet someone who could speak authoritatively about forgiveness. I have some theological questions that require expert consultation." The guards exchanged glances, clearly suspicious of Wright's unusually verbose and polite manner of speaking. In 15 years, most of them had never heard him string together more than a few words at a time. Father Santos leaned forward slightly, equally surprised by Wright's sudden articulateness. "I'm not a theologian or biblical scholar, Dennis," Jonathan replied carefully. "I'm just someone who has spent years studying Jesus' character and teachings for my role. What questions did you want to discuss?" Wright was silent for another long moment, and when he spoke again, something had shifted in his demeanor. The predatory coldness remained, but underneath it was something else, something that looked almost like uncertainty. "I killed 7 people," Wright said matter-of-factly. "But that's not the whole truth. I didn't just kill them quickly and move on. I took time with each of them. I made sure they understood what was happening, made sure they experienced maximum fear and pain before they died. I enjoyed every moment of it." The room seemed to grow even quieter, if that was possible. The guards had heard Wright's crimes described in clinical terms during briefings, but hearing him describe his actions in his own words with such casual detachment was deeply disturbing, even for experienced correctional officers. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained his composure and continued to meet Wright's gaze. "Why are you telling me this, Dennis?" "Because I want you to understand exactly who you're talking to before I ask my question," Wright replied. "I don't want you to think you're dealing with someone who made a mistake in a moment of passion, or someone who was driven to violence by circumstances beyond their control. I chose to do what I did because I enjoyed causing suffering. I am exactly the kind of person your Jesus warned people about." Wright paused, seemingly gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But here's what's strange, and why I requested this meeting. For the past year, I've been watching your show. At first, I watched it because I was curious about how Hollywood would portray someone I'd always viewed as a weakness-promoting charlatan. But as I continued watching, something unexpected happened." He looked down at his hands, still secured by the chain around his waist, and when he looked back up at Jonathan, there was something different in his expression. A crack in the facade of cold indifference that had characterized his behavior for 15 years. "I started to feel something I haven't felt since I was a child, something I thought I had successfully eliminated from my personality. I started to feel guilt." The admission seemed to surprise Wright as much as everyone else in the room. He had spoken the words with the same flat effect he used for everything else, but there was an undercurrent of confusion, as if he were describing a foreign language he had unexpectedly begun to understand. "For 15 years, I've been proud of what I did," Wright continued. "I've replayed the memories of my victims' suffering like other people replay favorite movies. I've felt no remorse, no regret, no wish that things had been different. I've been exactly what the psychologist said I was, a textbook sociopath without the capacity for normal human emotion." He paused again, and for the first time since entering the room, he seemed to struggle to find words. "But watching your portrayal of Jesus, seeing the way you show him responding to human suffering with compassion rather than judgment, something started to change inside me. I started to remember my victims not just as sources of entertainment, but as people who had families, dreams, futures that I destroyed for my own pleasure." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, sensing that they were approaching the real reason for Wright's request. "What changed specifically, Dennis? Was there a particular scene or moment that affected you?" Wright nodded slowly. "There was an episode where Jesus encounters a man who has done terrible things to other people. Instead of condemning him, or turning away in disgust, your Jesus looks at him with these eyes that seem to see everything, all the evil he's done, all the pain he's caused, but instead of hatred, there's something else. Something that looks almost like love. The serial killer's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, and for the first time in the conversation, he seemed genuinely vulnerable rather than performatively manipulative. I watched that scene 17 times, trying to understand how someone could look at evil and respond with love instead of revulsion. And gradually, I started to see myself the way I think your Jesus might see me. Not just as a predator or a monster, but as someone who chose darkness so completely that light had become foreign to him. Wright looked directly into Jonathan's eyes with an intensity that was different from his earlier predatory stare. This was the look of someone asking a question upon which their entire future depended. Here's what I need to know, and why I requested this meeting. Your Jesus talks about forgiveness being available to anyone who genuinely repents. But does that include someone like me? Someone who didn't kill in a moment of passion or desperation, but who methodically tortured and murdered innocent people because it brought me pleasure. Someone who spent 15 years feeling proud of those actions rather than sorry for them. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the room, guards who had become accustomed to Wright's cold detachment, Father Santos who had ministered to violent criminals for decades, and Jonathan, who had spent years exploring the depths of divine mercy through his portrayal of Jesus, seemed to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "I've started having dreams," Wright continued, his voice becoming even quieter. "Dreams where I see my victims not as they were when I killed them, terrified and in pain, but as they were before they met me. I see them laughing with friends, hugging their children, planning their futures. And in these dreams, I feel something I've never felt before in my adult life. I feel sorry. Not sorry that I got caught. Not sorry for the consequences I'm facing, but genuinely sorry that I caused so much pain to people who didn't deserve it." Wright's composure began to crack in ways that surprised everyone present. His voice remained controlled, but tears began to form in his eyes, the first display of genuine emotion anyone at Pelican Bay had ever witnessed from him. "But here's what terrifies me," he said. "I'm afraid that even if I'm genuinely sorry now, even if I've somehow developed the capacity for remorse that I never had before, it might be too late. How can someone like your Jesus forgive someone who spent decades enjoying the memory of innocent people suffering? How can there be redemption for someone who chose evil, not out of desperation or mental illness, but simply because it felt good?" The silence that followed Wright's question seemed to stretch forever. Jonathan was acutely aware that his response would either offer hope to someone experiencing what appeared to be genuine remorse, or potentially provide false comfort to a master manipulator who might be performing an elaborate psychological game. But as he looked into Wright's eyes, he saw something that convinced him this was not performance. It was the desperate honesty of someone confronting the full weight of their actions for the first time. "Dennis," Jonathan said carefully, "I want you to understand something before I answer your question. I'm not Jesus. I'm just an actor who has spent years trying to understand his character and teachings. But based on everything I've studied and experienced in preparing for this role, I believe the Jesus I portray would tell you that no sin is beyond the reach of divine forgiveness if the repentance is genuine." Wright leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow, hanging on every word. "But how can repentance be genuine when it comes so late? How can I claim to be truly sorry when I enjoyed those memories for 15 years before feeling any regret?" Jonathan nodded, acknowledging the complexity of the question. "I think the Jesus I know would say that the timing of your repentance doesn't diminish its authenticity. The fact that you're capable of feeling genuine remorse now, after years of not feeling it, might actually be evidence of grace working in your life in ways you don't understand." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The question isn't whether you're worthy of forgiveness. None of us are worthy of the kind of love and mercy that Jesus offers. The question is whether you're willing to accept it and allow it to continue transforming you from the inside out." Wright was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face as years of suppressed emotion seemed to pour out of him. The guards watched in amazement. Many of them had worked with Wright for years and had never seen him show any emotion other than cold indifference or predatory calculation. "But what about my victims?" Wright asked through his tears. Even if God can forgive me, how can I live with the knowledge of what I did to innocent people? How can I accept mercy when they'll never have the chance to live the lives I stole from them? Jonathan leaned back in his chair, understanding that they had moved beyond simple theological discussion into the realm of profound human transformation. Wright's question wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about whether redemption was possible for someone who had committed acts that seemed to place him outside the boundaries of human moral community. "Dennis," Jonathan said gently, "I think the Jesus I portray would tell you that carrying the weight of what you've done isn't incompatible with accepting forgiveness. In fact, it might be evidence that forgiveness is real and working in your life. Someone who truly didn't care about their victims wouldn't be tormented by guilt about them." Wright nodded slowly, seeming to process this idea. "You mean that feeling terrible about what I did might actually be a sign of healing rather than just punishment?" "I think so," Jonathan replied. "The fact that you can now see your victims as real people rather than just objects, the fact that their suffering matters to you now in ways it didn't before, the fact that you're tormented by guilt rather than entertained by memories, all of that suggests that something fundamental has changed in your heart." Wright was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "If that's true, if there's really a chance for someone like me to be forgiven and maybe even become someone different, what do I do with the rest of my life? I'm never getting out of here. I'm going to die in this place. How do I live with hope when there's no possibility of a normal future?" Jonathan felt the weight of the question, understanding that Wright was asking not just about theological concepts, but about practical ways to live with redemption in the most constrained circumstances imaginable. "Maybe," Jonathan said carefully, "your future isn't about getting out of here or having a normal life. Maybe it's about becoming someone who can help other people in here find the same kind of transformation you're experiencing. Maybe your story of change could give hope to other inmates who think they're beyond redemption." Wright looked up sharply, as if the possibility had never occurred to him. "You mean that someone like me could actually help other people instead of just causing harm?" "I think the Jesus I know would say that's exactly what redemption looks like," Jonathan replied. "Not just being forgiven for the harm you've done, but being transformed into someone who can participate in healing rather than causing more damage." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the fundamental transformation had already occurred. Wright's questions became less desperate and more curious, as if he were a student trying to understand a new subject rather than a drowning man grasping for salvation. He asked about practical steps for spiritual growth in prison, about ways to make amends for damage that could never be fully repaired, about how to live with both gratitude for forgiveness and appropriate sorrow for past actions. When the meeting finally ended, Wright thanked Jonathan with a sincerity that surprised everyone present. As he was escorted back to his cell, several guards commented that something fundamental seemed different about him. He walked differently, held his head differently, and for the first time in 15 years seemed to see the people around him as fellow human beings rather than potential threats or victims. Father Santos, who had witnessed hundreds of inmate conversations about faith and redemption, was deeply moved by what he had observed. "In 20 years of prison ministry," he told Jonathan afterward, "I've never seen anyone undergo such a profound transformation in such a short time. Whether it's real and lasting remains to be seen, but what happened in that room was unlike anything I've experienced." The guards who had been present began talking about the encounter with their colleagues, describing Wright's tears and apparent genuine remorse in ways that seemed almost impossible to believe for those who had known him only as the cold, predatory figure he had been for 15 years. Within days, word of Wright's transformation had spread throughout the prison, creating conversations about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of change that hadn't existed in that environment for years. In the weeks following his meeting with Jonathan, Wright began to demonstrate behavioral changes that convinced even skeptical prison officials that something genuine had occurred. He requested and was granted permission to attend chapel services for the first time in 15 years. He began writing letters to the families of his victims, not seeking forgiveness or contact, but simply acknowledging their loss and expressing genuine remorse for his actions. Most remarkably, Wright began reaching out to other inmates, particularly those serving long sentences who had given up hope of ever changing or finding meaning in their constrained circumstances. His conversations with fellow prisoners were unlike anything the counseling staff had observed. He spoke with the authority of someone who had experienced genuine transformation, but also with the humility of someone who understood the weight of past actions. Wright's cell, which had been notable for its sterile emptiness, began to reflect his changed priorities. He requested and was granted permission to have religious materials, and he began spending hours each day in prayer and study. But perhaps more significantly, he began using his limited resources to help other inmates, sharing his commissary purchases with those who had less, offering to help illiterate inmates write letters to their families, and serving as an informal counselor to men struggling with their own guilt and despair. The transformation was so dramatic that prison administrators initially suspected it might be an elaborate manipulation designed to earn privileges or improve Wright's conditions. But as months passed, his changed behavior proved consistent and genuine. Prison psychologists who evaluated him reported significant changes in his personality profile, noting the development of empathy, remorse, and concern for others that had been completely absent in previous assessments. Jonathan continued to correspond with Wright, providing spiritual guidance and encouragement as the former serial killer navigated the complex process of learning to live as someone fundamentally different from who he had been for most of his adult life. Their letters, which were monitored by prison officials, revealed Wright's ongoing struggle to balance appropriate guilt for his past actions with hope for continued spiritual growth, and the possibility of making positive contributions to the lives of fellow inmates. Word of Wright's transformation eventually reached the media, creating a storm of controversy about the nature of redemption, the possibility of genuine change among violent criminals, and the role of faith in rehabilitation. Some family members of Wright's victims expressed outrage at the suggestion that he could be forgiven or transformed, arguing that his crimes were so heinous that redemption was impossible. Others, however, found hope in the story, particularly families affected by violent crime who had struggled with questions about forgiveness and healing. The story became a case study in criminal justice programs, theological seminaries, and psychology courses across the country. Experts debated whether Wright's transformation was genuine, whether society should offer hope of redemption to those who had committed the most serious crimes, and what role, if any, spiritual intervention should play in the prison system. Jonathan found himself at the center of these debates, invited to speak at conferences and academic institutions about his experience with Wright and what it revealed about the nature of forgiveness and human transformation. He consistently emphasized that he was not an expert on criminal justice or theology, but simply someone who had witnessed what appeared to be genuine change in someone who had previously seemed irredeemable. The debate intensified when Wright requested permission to write a book about his transformation, hoping to share his story with other inmates and families affected by violent crime. Prison officials were initially reluctant to allow a serial killer to profit from his notoriety, but Wright proposed donating any proceeds to victims' rights organizations and programs that supported families of violent crime victims. Wright's transformation forced uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the purposes of imprisonment. If someone who had committed such heinous crimes could genuinely change and become someone capable of helping others, what did that say about the finality of moral judgment? If redemption was possible for someone like Wright, should society's response to violent crime focus more on rehabilitation than punishment? These questions became even more complex when other maximum security inmates began reporting their own spiritual transformations after speaking with Wright about his experience. Prison officials found themselves dealing with unprecedented requests for religious counseling, chapel attendance, and spiritual materials from inmates who had previously shown no interest in such things. The phenomenon spread beyond Pelican Bay as Wright's story became known in other maximum security facilities. Inmates serving life sentences began to hope that their circumstances didn't necessarily preclude the possibility of personal growth and positive contribution to the lives of others. Chaplains at other prisons reported increased interest in religious services and counseling among their most hardened inmates. Critics argued that Wright's transformation, however genuine it might appear, could not undo the harm he had caused or justify offering hope to others who had committed similar crimes. They worried that focusing on redemption might minimize the suffering of victims and send dangerous messages about accountability for violent actions. Supporters countered that genuine transformation, wherever it occurred, demonstrated the possibility of human change and growth that should be encouraged rather than dismissed. They argued that Wright's ability to help other inmates find meaning and hope in their constrained circumstances was evidence that redemption could create positive outcomes even in the most unlikely situations. 5 years after his meeting with Jonathan, Wright had become an informal leader among the maximum security population at Pelican Bay, known for his willingness to listen to other inmates' struggles and his ability to offer both practical advice and spiritual encouragement. Prison officials, while maintaining appropriate security measures, had come to value his positive influence on facility culture and his role in reducing violence among the inmate population. Wright's correspondence with families of his victims had evolved into a complex ongoing dialogue about forgiveness, healing, and the possibility of finding meaning in senseless tragedy. While some families maintained that they could never forgive him, others had found that engaging with his genuine remorse had helped them process their own grief and find ways to move forward. His letters to Jonathan continued to reveal an ongoing process of spiritual growth and grappling with complex questions about living faithfully in circumstances that would never change. Wright wrote about the challenge of maintaining hope while accepting responsibility for irreversible harm, about learning to help others while living with appropriate guilt for past actions, and about finding purpose in a life that would never include freedom or normal human relationships. Jonathan's visits to Pelican Bay became regular occurrences, not just to meet with Wright, but to speak with other inmates who had been influenced by his story. What had begun as a single encounter between an actor and a serial killer had evolved into an ongoing ministry that challenged assumptions about redemption, transformation, and the possibility of finding divine grace in the darkest circumstances. The sterile visiting room where they had first met had become the site of numerous conversations about faith, forgiveness, and the complex process of learning to live with both mercy and justice. Each visit reinforced Jonathan's understanding that his portrayal of Jesus on screen was inseparable from his willingness to embody those same principles of compassion and hope in real-life encounters with people whom society had written off as unredeemable. Wright's story continued to raise questions that had no easy answers. Was genuine redemption possible for anyone? Regardless of their actions, could someone who had caused immeasurable harm become a source of healing for others? Did the possibility of transformation justify hope for even the most violent criminals? Or did some actions place people beyond the reach of both human and divine mercy? What remained clear was that Wright's encounter with Jonathan had demonstrated the transformative power of genuine compassion extended to those who seemed least deserving of it. Whether that transformation would prove lasting, whether it could truly compensate for the harm Wright had caused, and whether similar redemption was possible for others in comparable circumstances remained open questions that challenged both religious and secular understandings of justice, mercy, and human potential. The maximum security wing of Pelican Bay State Prison, designed to warehouse society's most dangerous criminals in permanent isolation, had become an unlikely laboratory for exploring the deepest questions about human nature and the possibility of change. Wright's cell, once notable for its emptiness and the cold indifference of its occupant, had become a place where hope and transformation coexisted with appropriate acknowledgement of irreversible harm and permanent consequences. In the end, Wright's question about whether Jesus could forgive even someone like him had been answered not through theological argument, but through lived experience. The gradual transformation of a man who had embodied evil into someone capable of offering hope and healing to others walking similar paths of darkness and seeking their own encounters with redemption.